I grew up in northern Oregon, where dense forests press against every town like silent sentinels. My friends and I would often camp deep in those woods. We were 18, and those trips were an excuse to escape our lives, drink beer, and enjoy a sliver of freedom. One Friday evening, we impulsively decided to head out to a lake called Dove Creek, a place we'd only heard about but never visited. It was a last-minute plan, just blankets, some snacks, and a case of beer my older brother scored for us. We arrived as the sun set, parking in a small clearing surrounded by towering evergreens. A thin trail led deeper into the woods, where the lake supposedly waited. We built a fire, cracked open our drinks, and let the night swallow us. Everything felt normal until someone suggested a swim. It was supposed to be a fun, harmless idea. Buzzed and laughing, we made our way along the narrow trail. But about 15 minutes in, the air shifted, as if the night had suddenly noticed us. It had been a warm evening, but out of nowhere, the air turned sharp, unnervingly cold. Every hair on my arm stood on end. We didn't say a word. We didn't need to. We all just stopped. Frozen in place, the forest pressed in around us, silent as a held breath. Then, without warning, we turned as one and bolted back toward the car. The fear hit like a thunderclap. I didn't care about anything except getting back, my only thought being, don't be the last one to the car. I ran faster than I ever have, the underbrush slapping my legs, but there was something behind me. Not footsteps, not an animal, just a presence. Something heavy, like dread itself, chased us back through the woods. We tumbled into the car, slamming the doors and starting the engine with trembling hands. As we peeled out of the clearing, our fire still crackling behind us, no one spoke. Not a word the entire drive home. Weeks later, I attended a family camping trip at the request of my parents. Around the fire, the topic of strange hiking experiences came up. That's when one of the other campers, a man I barely knew, told his story. He and a few friends had gone hiking along Dove Creek the month before. They reached a high cliff overlooking the lake. But as soon as they arrived, every one of them was seized by an overwhelming sense that they were in mortal danger. They didn't take pictures, didn't unpack their lunch. They just ran. And like us, they never talked about it afterward. When he told that story, my stomach turned cold. It was the exact same place. But here's the part that still haunts me. He said, just before they fled, he had felt like his life was flashing before his eyes, like he'd glimpsed the last few moments of his existence. I never told him what we had experienced that night at Dove Creek, and I never went back. I had driven the route a dozen times, but that night, I took a wrong turn, and that one mistake still haunts me. It was late, around midnight, and the roads were empty except for my car. I should have been home in 20 minutes, but the unfamiliar road, I found myself on twisted and curved deeper into the woods. The trees leaned in too close, branches like claws scraping against the roof. My headlights illuminated only the narrow strip of asphalt in front of me, and beyond that, just darkness. I told myself it was no big deal. Just keep driving. I'd hit a main road soon enough. But the further I went, the narrower the road became, and the forest around me thickened, swallowing the sky. My GPS had lost signal 10 minutes ago, and there wasn't a single street light or sign in sight. The uneasy feeling started low like a twinge in the gut. I turned down the music, hoping the silence would help me concentrate. That's when I noticed how loud my own breathing had become, a quiet but constant reminder that I was completely alone. Or so I thought. As I rounded a bend, something flickered at the edge of my headlights, a figure standing at the side of the road. I barely had time to register what I saw, slamming on the brakes instinctively. The car skidded to a stop, tires kicking up gravel. My heart hammered in my chest as I scanned the road behind me through the rearview mirror. But there was nothing there now, just the empty road and the dark forest pressing in from both sides. I exhaled, trying to convince myself I imagined it. Just a trick of the light, right? But that strange weight in my chest didn't go away. I eased off the brake, rolling forward slowly, my fingers gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. A little farther down the road, the asphalt ended abruptly, transitioning into a rough dirt path. I cursed under my breath. I must have taken a private road. The thought of turning back didn't sit well, though. Something told me to keep going, just to see if there was a way out on the other side. The path twisted sharply, and as I rounded the bend, the same figure stood there again. This time, the headlights hit him full on. A man, mid-40s, wearing an old jacket and jeans. He didn't flinch, didn't raise a hand to wave, just stood there, facing me, staring straight into my windshield. My blood ran cold. His face was pale, almost waxy in the harsh light, and something about his stillness set every instinct in me screaming. I shifted the car into reverse. I wasn't about to roll down the window or try to talk to him, but as I slowly backed up, the man took a step toward the car. Then another, and another. His movements were slow and deliberate, like he knew I had nowhere to go. Panic bubbled up in my throat. I jammed the gear shift into drive and floored it, the car lurching forward with a spray of dirt. I swerved around him, barely missing him, and glanced in the rearview mirror as I sped down the path. He stood in the middle of the road, motionless, watching me drive away. My heart was pounding in my ears. I needed to find the main road fast. The dirt path ahead twisted and dipped, throwing my car side to side as I gripped the wheel. I could feel the tires struggling against the uneven ground. Every bump made my stomach churn. And then up ahead, I saw something that made my skin crawl, a car parked halfway across the path. Its lights were off, and its front bumper was smashed, as if it had collided with something recently. The hood was slightly open, steam rising into the cold night air. I slowed to a crawl, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The thought of stopping made my chest tighten, but I had no choice. The path was too narrow to go around. That's when I saw him again, the same man standing beside the broken car. His blank expression hadn't changed. He wasn't trying to wave me down or ask for help. He just stood there, waiting. I put the car in reverse again, but this time, my tires spun uselessly in the loose dirt. No traction. I was stuck. My breathing grew shallow, my pulse drumming in my ears. I glanced between the man and the rearview mirror, hoping to see an escape route. And that's when I noticed another figure. This one stood further back in the woods, half hidden among the trees. And then another, and another, silent silhouettes, watching me from the darkness. How long had they been there? I slammed my hand on the horn, once, twice, trying to scare them off. But the figures didn't move. They just stood there, unmoving, their eyes locked on me. And then, slowly, the man by the broken car reached into his jacket. Something metallic glinted in his hand, a crowbar. He started walking toward me, his steps heavy and purposeful. I floored the accelerator again, my tires spinning wildly against the dirt. The car lurched forward, finally catching, and I shot past him, missing his outstretched hand by inches. I didn't look back. I kept driving until the path finally spat me out onto a paved road. I didn't stop, didn't breathe, until I was miles away, the forest far behind me. When I finally got home, I sat in the driveway, hands still trembling on the wheel. I checked the news the next day, but there were no reports of accidents or missing persons near the area. No mention of a car or strange figures on the road. I'm never driven that way again, but sometimes on quiet nights, I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for someone else to take the wrong turn. I moved into a 2-floor house with my sister, hoping for peace, but peace doesn't always last. She often stayed with her boyfriend, leaving me alone most nights. I'm 30, and being alone shouldn't bother me, but sometimes it does. One Saturday night, I sat on the couch, watching an old horror movie. The open layout of the living room made it feel like there was too much space, too many unseen corners behind me. With my back to the dark kitchen, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling watched, though I was alone. The only light came from the flickering TV screen, casting eerie shapes that danced across the room. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But after the movie ended, the house felt too still. I turned off the TV, brushed my teeth, and crawled into bed. The silence in the house pressed against my ears, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. 2 hours later, I woke up abruptly. Something had stirred me, but I didn't know what. Then I heard it, a voice from downstairs. It sounded like my sister. her voice, but off somehow, as if she was too far away or slightly distorted. She wasn't calling from outside the house, though. She was already inside. Still groggy and confused, I sat up in bed, straining to hear what she was saying. She called my name, softly at first, and I wondered why she hadn't texted me if she needed help. The house felt cold as I slipped out of bed. I stood in the dark hallway, flicked on the light, and squinted toward the stairs. Her voice echoed again, sharper this time, from somewhere below. "Alex," she called, insistent but strange, like she was annoyed that I hadn't answered sooner. My stomach twisted with unease. I yelled back, "What is it?" But there was no reply. For a moment, I considered staying upstairs and waiting until morning. Something felt wrong, but curiosity pulled at me, and before I could second-guess myself, I started down the stairs, one cautious step at a time. The lights were still off below. I switched on the stairwell light, hoping she'd just forgotten her keys and was waiting for me to open the front door. But the hallway was empty, and the door was locked from the inside. Her voice came again, from the kitchen this time. I walked toward it, feeling my pulse hammering harder with every step. I knew I should call her, just to make sure, but I didn't. I don't know why. When I reached the kitchen doorway, the light from the hall only illuminated half the room. The rest was swathed in shadows. There was no one there, and then I heard her again, whispering my name from right behind me. I spun around, my heart slamming in my chest. The hallway was still empty, but a chill washed over me, colder than the night air outside. I rushed back upstairs, half running, half stumbling, and slammed my bedroom door shut. My hands were shaking as I locked it. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of a clock. But no footsteps, no voices. I told myself it had to be my imagination. Maybe I dreamed the whole thing, or maybe it was the leftover anxiety from the movie. I forced myself back into bed, pulling the blanket tight around me, and lay there listening to the silence, my ears tuned for any sign of movement. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate ones, starting from downstairs and making their way up the stairs step by step. I held my breath, heart hammering in my throat. My bedroom door was locked, but the thin wood felt like it could shatter if someone leaned on it the wrong way. I heard the steps reach the top of the stairs, then stop, right outside my room. The doorknob jiggled once, softly, then turned again, more forcefully. I pressed myself flat against the mattress, praying the lock would hold. A shiver ran down my spine as the handle rattled harder, more insistent this time, and then silence. Whoever was just stood there. I could hear the faintest rustle of clothing, like they were leaning against the door, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen, listening, every nerve screaming at me to stay quiet. Eventually, the footsteps retreated, soft but unmistakable, moving back down the stairs. The front door opened with a slow, deliberate creak, then shut with a soft click. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I called my sister, asking if she'd come home. She hadn't. She'd spent the night with her boyfriend, 20 miles away, and hadn't set foot in the house. When I checked the front door, the lock was still latched from the inside. The apartment felt perfect when I first moved in, quiet, affordable, and close to work. The kind of place where you don't expect trouble. But that changed after I met Brian. It was the second day when he knocked. I opened the door to find a man in his mid-40s, thin, with an awkward grin plastered across his face. He stood too close, his eyes too eager, flickering between my face and the inside of my apartment. His faded t-shirt was stained at the collar, and I noticed a faint smell of cigarettes clinging to him. "Hey there," he said, voice bright but forced. "I'm Brian. Thought I'd say welcome. Need any help getting settled?" I shook my head with a polite smile. "I've got it, thanks." He lingered a second too long, still smiling. "Well, I'm just next door if you need anything," he said, nodding toward the door opposite mine. It felt less like a friendly gesture and more like a reminder. After he left, I shut the door and locked it. I chalked the weird vibe up to paranoia. It was just new neighbor awkwardness, I told myself. But something about the way he smiled, like he was holding back a secret stuck with me. That night, I stayed up late unpacking. Around midnight, just as I was starting to feel drowsy, I heard 3 knocks at the door. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the hallway outside was silent. I tiptoed to the door and looked through the peephole. No one was there. I waited, heart hammering, wondering if I'd imagined it. But just as I turned away, another knock, soft, deliberate, and patient. I held my breath, not daring to move. The seconds dragged out like hours. Finally, I heard footsteps, slow and heavy, shuffling down the hallway. They didn't sound like they were leaving, though. They stopped just outside my neighbor Brian's door. The next morning, I ran into Brian on my way to work. He greeted me with that same grin, but this time his eyes held a flicker of something else, like he knew more than he was saying. I asked, as casually as I could, if he'd heard knocking the night before. His grin stayed intact, but the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. "Must be the pipes," he said with a shrug. "This place is old, you know." That evening, I made sure every door and window was locked. But just past 3 a.m., the knocks came again. 3 soft taps, deliberate and unhurried, as if the person on the other side knew I was awake. I stayed in bed, barely breathing. Then I heard the sound of the doorknob rattling, followed by the soft scrape of nails dragging down the wood. A knot of fear tightened in my chest. Someone was testing the lock. I wanted to grab my phone, but it was across the room, and moving felt impossible. The door rattled again, harder this time, like whoever was wanted to see how much force it would take to get inside. I pressed my hands over my mouth to keep from making a sound. After a few agonizing moments, the rattling stopped. Footsteps shuffled slowly down the hall, heavy and deliberate. I waited, ears straining, until I heard it, the soft click of Brian's door opening. Then it shut quietly, like nothing unusual had happened. The next day, I went straight to the building manager. I explained everything: the knocking, the footsteps, and Brian's strange behavior. The manager gave me a sympathetic look, but shrugged. "Brian's lived here for years. He's odd, but harmless," she said, as if that was supposed to comfort me. That night, I pushed a chair under the doorknob and sat up with a kitchen knife in hand, waiting. But the knocks didn't come. Not that night, or the next. I tried to relax, telling myself it was over. A week later, Brian was gone. I saw him loading boxes into a moving van early one morning, whistling softly as he worked. The building manager told me he decided to move suddenly, said he wanted a change of scenery. I should have felt relieved, but some nights, even now, I wake up to the sound of those same soft knocks in my dreams. 3 taps, deliberate and patient, waiting for me to answer. I rented a remote cabin in the woods, hoping the isolation would give me space to write. The plan was simple, just me, my laptop, and quiet nights. The first few days passed without incident, just the usual sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, wind moving through the trees, and the occasional creak of the old cabin settling. But on the 3rd night, everything changed. It was just past midnight when I heard it. 3 knocks at the door. I had been half asleep on the couch, a blanket wrapped around me, the dull glow of my laptop casting weak light across the room. The knocks jolted me awake. I sat up, heart racing, trying to make sense of it. Who could be out here, this far from town, in the middle of the night? I stayed still, listening. Maybe it had been the wind? But then, the knock came again, louder, more deliberate. A chill ran down my spine. I crept toward the window, moving slowly so the old floorboards wouldn't give me away. I nudged the curtain aside, just enough to see. The porch light flickered weakly, illuminating the front door. But no one was there. I stared out into the darkness, searching the edges of the porch and the shadows beyond. Nothing. Another knock. This time it sounded like it was right next to me, just on the other side of the door. I sucked in a breath and stepped back, trying to convince myself it was a lost hiker, maybe someone looking for help. But if that were the case, why wouldn't they call out? I forced myself to move closer, hand trembling as I reached for the door. Not to open it, just to listen, see if they'd say something. But as I leaned in, the handle began to turn. I stumbled back, heart hammering, my breath caught in my throat. Whoever it was, they weren't knocking for help. They were trying to get inside. The handle twisted again, slow and deliberate, rattling softly against the lock. I clutched the fire poker from the hearth, holding it tight in both hands. The door held. The old lock was doing its job, but barely. I watched the knob, paralyzed, until the rattling stopped. Silence. Then, I heard the faintest sound, footsteps crunching softly on gravel. They were moving along the side of the cabin, heading toward the back door. My stomach knotted as I followed the sound, creeping to the rear window. The figure drifted past, just a dark outline against the moonlit trees. I moved quickly, checking the back door. Locked, but the footsteps stopped, right on the other side. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the doorknob jiggled once, twice, testing the lock. My chest felt tight, my pulse roaring in my ears. I could almost feel them standing there, waiting. The knob twisted harder, but the lock held. The seconds dragged on, stretching longer with every breath I held. And then, the footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I crouched low beneath the kitchen window as the shadow passed once more. They weren't lost. They were confused. They were looking for a way in. The sound drifted to the front of the house again. I clenched the fire poker, hands slick with sweat. The knock came once more, just as slow and deliberate as before, like a question hanging in the air. "Are you going to let me in?" I didn't move. I stayed perfectly still, breath shallow, heart slamming in my chest. Minutes passed, maybe hours, the night stretching on endlessly. And then, without warning, the knocking stopped. The footsteps faded into the forest. Silence swallowed the cabin once more. I didn't move from my spot until the first light of dawn bled through the windows. When I finally stood, my legs were stiff, my hands still shaking. I walked to the front door, slowly unlocking it, and opened it just a crack. The porch was empty. No signs of anyone. But just at the edge of the steps, pressed into the dirt, was a single fresh footprint. I packed my things and left that morning, never looking back. I always hike alone. It's my way of getting away from everything, clearing my head. But one afternoon, a few miles into a remote trail, I realized that not all isolation is peaceful. The trail cut through dense forest before climbing up to an exposed ridge, where the trees gave way to views of distant hills. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind in the branches, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. I told myself it was just the stillness of autumn settling in, but the silence weighed on me more than usual. At first, the ridge felt like a relief, a chance to breathe after the tight corridors of trees. But as I stepped out into the open, I noticed him. A man stood further up the trail, about 50 yards ahead. He was facing away from me, his body slightly hunched, wearing a faded green jacket. He looked out of place, like he didn't belong there. I slowed my steps, debating whether to keep going or turn back. As I hesitated, he shifted, turning his head just slightly, as if he knew I was there. He didn't call out or wave, just stood still, watching from the corner of his eye. A wave of unease washed over me. It's just another hiker, I told myself, but something about the way he held himself, the way he didn't move, it wasn't right. I forced myself to keep walking, heart pounding with every step. He was too far away to be a threat, I told myself. Just pass him, nod politely, and move on. I kept my head down, focusing on the crunch of my boots against the gravel. As I got closer, I realized something strange. He wasn't carrying anything. No backpack, no water, no gear. Just his hands jammed deep into the pockets of his jacket. What was he doing this far out with nothing? I felt the pressure of his gaze, sharp and deliberate, even as I pretended not to notice him. When I was about 10 feet away, he spoke for the first time, softly, as if the words were only meant for me. "Where are you headed?" The question sent a jolt through me, not because of the words, but the way he said them. Too casual, like he already knew the answer. I mumbled something about finishing the loop and kept walking, refusing to look back. My instinct screamed at me to keep moving. I picked up my pace, hoping to put distance between us, but the sound of footsteps followed. Slow, deliberate steps, matching my rhythm. My stomach twisted. He wasn't just hiking, he was following me. I glanced over my shoulder. He He was closer now. His eyes locked onto mine, cold and unwavering. He gave me a small smile, not friendly but knowing. My pulse raced. I needed to stay calm, to think, run, and he might chase. Walk too slowly, and he might close the gap. I had to keep moving just fast enough to stay ahead without looking like prey. The trail narrowed as it dipped back into the forest. The branches closed in, shadows stretching across the path. I quickened my pace, trying to disappear into the trees. But every time I thought I'd gained some ground, I'd hear his footsteps, steady, relentless. I fought the urge to sprint. Not yet. Not until I was sure. The trail curved sharply ahead, and I saw my chance. If I could get around the bend without him seeing, I could break into a run. I rounded the corner and bolted. My heart pounded against my ribs, legs burning as I tore down the path. I didn't care about the rocks or roots underfoot. I just needed to get away. I ran until my lungs screamed, the world a blur of branches and dirt. When I finally dared to glance back, the trail behind me was empty. No sign of him. I forced myself to keep going, even as my legs wobbled and my breath came in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead. My car was the only one in the lot, just as it had been when I arrived. I slammed the door shut, hands shaking as I locked it. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the trees, waiting for him to appear. But the woods were still. I never saw him again. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that he let me go, that he could have caught me if he'd wanted to. I took the night shift at a small-town convenience store because I needed the money. The job seemed easy: sit behind the counter, ring people up, and wait for morning. But there's a kind of dread that settles in when the world goes quiet, and you're the only person awake. The first few hours went by uneventfully, just a couple of customers buying cigarettes or energy drinks. Around 2 a.m., the store was empty except for me, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the low hum of the fridge units in the back. The silence felt too thick, like the world outside had stopped. Then, the door chime jingled, and a man walked in. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing an old hoodie and jeans, his hair greasy and matted. He moved slowly, as if every step was deliberate. I offered a quick, polite nod, but he didn't respond. He just stared at me as he crossed the threshold, his eyes lingering a second too long. Something about the way he moved made my skin crawl. He drifted toward the aisles without picking anything up, glancing over the shelves as if trying to decide what he wanted, or maybe just pretending to browse. I kept my eyes on him, my stomach knotting tighter with each passing second. After a few minutes, he came to the counter, holding a single pack of gum. It felt like an excuse, a reason to come closer. He placed the gum on the counter and gave me a crooked smile. Something about it was all wrong, too wide, too forced. "You work alone?" he asked casually, his voice soft but laced with something that set my nerves on edge. I forced a smile. "Just me and the cameras," I said, nodding toward the security monitors above the counter. A lie. There were no working cameras, just old plastic shells to make people think they were being watched. His smile didn't waver. He pulled out a crumpled bill, handing it to me with fingers that lingered too long against mine. I pulled back quickly, trying to hide my discomfort. As I handed him his change, his grin widened. "You ever get scared, being here all alone?" he asked, still standing too close to the counter, not moving to leave. I shrugged, keeping my tone light. "Not really." He chuckled softly, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of laugh someone makes when they know something you don't. The man didn't leave. He stood there for another moment, just watching me. I stared back, forcing myself not to look away, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. Finally, after what felt like hours, he stuffed the gum into his pocket and shuffled out the door. I exhaled, but the tension didn't leave my chest. Something told me he wasn't done. For the next hour, I kept glancing at the front door, waiting for him to come back. The parking lot outside was empty except for my car under the flickering streetlight. The rest of the world felt impossibly far away. At 3:30 a.m., just as I started to convince myself the worst was over, the door chimed again. It was him. He stepped inside slowly, hands in his hoodie pockets, his expression unreadable. The grin was gone. This time he didn't browse. He stood just inside the door, eyes locked on me, as if waiting for me to make the first move. My heart raced. I tried to act calm, reaching under the counter where I kept a small baseball bat. My fingers fumbled, slick with sweat. "You don't look so brave now," he muttered, taking a step closer. His voice was low, almost playful, but there was an edge to it that made my skin prickle. The air in the store felt heavy, suffocating. I glanced toward the back exit, wondering if I could make a run for it. Then, the door chimed again. This time, 2 men in reflective vests walked in, clearly on a break from the nearby construction site. The man in the hoodie froze, his gaze flicking toward them. For a moment, I thought he might stay, but then he stuffed his hands deeper into his pockets and backed away, muttering something under his breath. Without another word, he slipped out the door and disappeared into the night. I didn't move until the 2 workers approached the counter, chatting casually as if nothing strange had happened. It wasn't until morning that I realized how close I'd come to something far worse. He wasn't there to shop. He was waiting for the right moment, hoping no one else would show up. I quit the job that same week. And to this day, I wonder what would have happened if those construction workers hadn't walked in when they did. It was supposed to be a quick trip to the gas station, 10 minutes in and out. But that night, 10 minutes was all it took for everything to go wrong. I pulled up to the pump just after 11 p.m., the lot empty except for a beat-up pickup parked off to the side. The gas station sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields and a dense tree line. It was the kind of place that felt isolated, even with the lights on. I got out of the car, the cold air biting against my skin. The nozzle clicked as I set it to fill, and I crossed my arms to keep warm, glancing around out of habit. That's when I noticed the pickup truck. 2 men sat inside, faces hidden under baseball caps, watching me. They weren't talking, just sitting there too still, too focused. I looked away quickly, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. It's nothing, I told myself. Just 2 guys waiting around, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The pump clicked, signaling my tank was full. I replaced the nozzle, trying to stay calm, but my hands felt clumsy and cold. As I stepped toward the store to grab a drink, the pickup door creaked open behind me. One of the men got out, a large guy in his late 30s, wearing a heavy jacket and jeans. He didn't say anything, just stared as he shut the door behind him and leaned against the truck. His eyes followed me, sharp and deliberate. I tried to keep my cool, my heart pounding harder with each step. The store door felt a mile away. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed faintly, and the clerk, a kid no older than 20, was on his phone, barely glancing up. I wanted to feel safer inside, but the tension in my chest didn't ease. I grabbed a soda from the fridge and went to the counter. The clerk rang me up, uninterested, while I tried to calm the swirling thoughts in my head. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting. As I slid my card into the reader, the bell above the door jingled. The man from the truck had followed me inside. He didn't buy anything. He didn't even look at the shelves. He just stood near the door, hands in his jacket pockets, his eyes locked on me. I forced a smile at the clerk, grabbed my drink, and made my way toward the exit, my pulse hammering in my ears. As I stepped outside, the man moved with me, shadowing my every step. I quickened my pace, heading straight for my car. That's when I saw the second man, standing near my passenger door, his back to me. He was pretending to look at his phone, but his body language screamed something else, waiting. Every instinct told me to run, but my car felt like the only safe place. I fumbled for my keys, trying not to look panicked, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I yanked open the driver's side door and slid inside, locking it behind me. Just as I reached to lock the passenger door, the second man's hand yanked at the handle. His face was inches from the window, eyes wild as he realized it was locked. I slammed the gear shift into reverse, tires screeching as I backed out of the spot. The man pounded once on the window, hard enough to leave a smudge before stumbling backward. The truck's engine roared to life, headlights flashing on. They were coming after me. I didn't think, I just floored it, tires kicking up gravel as I shot toward the exit. For a terrifying moment, the truck swerved into the lane behind me, its headlights blinding in my rearview mirror. They followed me onto the highway, staying close, as if daring me to pull over. My hands gripped the wheel so tight it hurt, my heart racing in my chest. But after a mile or so, the truck suddenly veered off at the next exit, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't slow down. I drove straight home, my pulse hammering the entire way. When I got back, I parked in my driveway, locking the doors twice just to feel safe. Only then did I realize how close I'd come to something far worse. I told myself I'd call the police, but what could I say? That 2 men followed me and scared me. No crime had been committed. Still, I knew if I hadn't locked that passenger door in time, the night might have ended differently. To this day, I never stop at that gas station after dark. It was late, and I had just finished a shift at the restaurant where I work. I was exhausted, and all I wanted was to get home as quickly as possible. The streets were unusually quiet that night. I decided to take a shortcut through a neighborhood I didn't know well. It wasn't the smartest choice, but I figured it would shave a few minutes off my walk. The houses along the street looked old and tired, their windows dark, as if the whole neighborhood had gone to sleep hours ago. The only sound was the tap of my shoes against the pavement. About halfway down the block, I noticed a man walking ahead of me. He wore a gray hoodie with the hood pulled tight, his steps slow and uneven. I wasn't sure if I should keep going or turn back. Something about him seemed off, but I told myself I was being paranoid, just tired from work. I crossed the street, putting some distance between us, and kept my pace steady. He didn't speed up or change direction, just kept walking, his head tilted slightly to the side, as if listening for something. I forced my gaze forward, trying to focus on the sidewalk ahead. The sooner I got home, the better. But as I kept walking, I noticed something unsettling. Every time I quickened my pace, so did he. Every step I took, he matched like we were locked into some kind of silent rhythm. My pulse picked up, and a knot formed in my stomach. The back of my neck prickled with a heavy sense of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the streets were empty, just me and him. As I reached the end of the block, I hoped he would turn a different way, but he didn't. He crossed the street with me, keeping the same slow, deliberate pace, like he wasn't in a hurry, but had all the time in the world to follow. I tried to stay calm, but every instinct screamed at me to run. Not yet. Don't give him a reason to chase. I turned the next corner, hoping to lose him. I glanced back, and there he was, rounding the corner just a few steps behind. The distance between us had shrunk. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breaths came in shallow bursts. It was no longer just a shortcut home. It was a race. I spotted an alley up ahead, a narrow space between 2 old apartment buildings. If I could get through it, I'd come out near a busier street. People, lights, safety. I made a sharp turn into the alley, my feet slapping against the pavement. The air was thick and cold, pressing against my skin. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out everything else. Every step felt heavier, every breath sharper. And then I heard him. His footsteps echoed behind me, quick and eager, like he knew I was running. I sprinted toward the end of the alley, praying it wasn't a dead end. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare slow down. I could feel him closing in, his footsteps growing louder, faster, a predator moving in for the kill. Finally, I saw it, a sliver of light spilling from the street beyond. I pushed myself harder, legs burning, heart ready to burst. I reached the end of the alley and stumbled out onto the sidewalk, gasping for air. The street was empty, but brightly lit, a strange, eerie contrast to the darkness I had just escaped. I spun around, expecting him to be right behind me, but the alley was empty. He was gone. No footsteps, no shadow, nothing. Just the quiet hum of streetlights and the distant sound of traffic. I stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Had he slipped away into the shadows? I waited a moment longer, scanning the alley one last time. When I was sure he was gone, I turned and hurried home, the cold night air biting against my skin. I didn't stop until I was inside, with every lock secured behind me. I never took that shortcut again, and even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, just waiting for someone else to turn down the wrong street. I've been driving for a rideshare app for a few years now, mostly at night, where I can make extra cash with fewer cars on the road. Most nights, it's uneventful, but one ride made me question if I'd ever do this job again. It was around 2 a.m. when the request popped up, a pickup in a dim part of town. It wasn't uncommon for requests to come from rough areas, especially that late. I hesitated for a moment, but I hit accept. Just a few more rides and I'd call it a night. When I arrived, a man was standing at the curb under a flickering streetlight, wearing a dark hoodie. He wasn't looking at his phone, which was weird. Most riders are glued to their screens, tracking their ride. "Mark," I called out, checking the name on the app. The man glanced up, his hood still hiding most of his face. "Yeah," he muttered, not looking me in the eye. He walked over to the car slowly, with a strange sense of purpose. I felt a flicker of unease. Something about him didn't sit right, but I unlocked the doors anyway. He slid into the back seat without saying another word. I could feel the air shift, a subtle tension like the space had just gotten a little smaller. I tried to shake it off, forcing myself to focus on the ride. I glanced at the destination on the app, but it wasn't showing properly, just a glitching map. That was odd, but not unheard of. "Where are we heading?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He leaned forward slightly, just enough that I could feel his presence hovering too close. "Just drive," he said softly. His tone was calm, but there was no kindness in it. Every instinct told me to cancel the ride and get out of there, but something about him, the way he seemed to expect me to obey, froze me. I forced a nod and started driving, the silence in the car pressing down on me like a weight. "Turn left here," he said after a few minutes, his voice so casual it felt rehearsed. I hesitated for a second, my knuckles white against the steering wheel, but I did as he said. The streets grew darker, narrower. The city lights faded behind us. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked again, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. He didn't answer right away. "You'll know when we get there," he said eventually, a strange smile playing at the edge of his words. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't a normal ride. My heart pounded in my chest. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but his face was shadowed beneath the hood. I couldn't read his expression, but I felt his eyes on me. Sharp, deliberate. I slowed at a stoplight, my mind racing. I needed to do something. The street was empty, not a soul in sight, and I knew if I didn't act fast, I might not get another chance. With my pulse roaring in my ears, I made a decision. I slammed the brakes. The man jerked forward, caught off guard. "What the hell?" he snapped, gripping the seat in front of him. I didn't wait. I threw the car in a park, twisted in my seat, and looked him dead in the eye. "Get out," I said, my voice low and steady. For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Time seemed to stretch thin, each second heavier than the last. Then, slowly, he smiled, a thin, knowing grin that made my skin crawl. He opened the door and climbed out, moving with eerie calm. Before closing the door, he leaned down just slightly, his grin widening. "You're lucky," he murmured. "Next driver won't be." The door clicked shut, and just like that, he was gone, melting into the shadows of the empty street. I sat there, frozen, my hands trembling on the wheel. The silence inside the car was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something terrible. I canceled the ride and drove home in a daze, checking my mirrors the whole way. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I locked the doors and sat in the dark, his words replaying over and over in my mind. To this day, I still wonder if Mark was even real, or if the man who got into my car that night was just looking for the wrong passenger. I used to cut through the train yard on my way home from work. It was faster than taking the main road, especially on cold nights. But after what happened that winter, I'll never walk that way again. The tracks were empty, and a heavy fog hung low over the yard, muffling every sound. The silence felt too deep, too complete. I pulled my coat tighter and picked up my pace, hoping to make it home before the chills sank into my bones. I was about halfway across the yard when I saw him, a man standing near one of the old freight cars. He wasn't moving, just standing there with his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, head tilted as if he was waiting for something. I told myself he was probably just another worker, someone pulling a night shift. But something about the way he stood, the stillness of him, set me on edge. I kept walking, trying not to look directly at him, hoping he wouldn't notice me. But as I passed, I felt it, his eyes tracking my every step. The weight of his gaze pressed on me, making the air feel heavier. I glanced back, just to be sure he wasn't following. He was still standing in the same spot, but now he was facing me, just watching. My stomach twisted, and I forced my feet to move faster. It was only a few more minutes to the edge of the yard, just a few more steps, and I'd be back on the main road. But with every step, the feeling of being followed grew stronger, like invisible threads, pulling tighter and tighter. Then I heard it, the crunch of gravel underfoot, just behind me. I turned my head slightly, trying to make it look casual, but what I saw sent ice through my veins. The man was walking now, moving slowly along the tracks in my direction. He wasn't rushing, but his steps were deliberate, as if he knew I had nowhere to go. His calmness made it worse. It was like he had all the time in the world to catch up. My pulse hammered in my ears. I told myself not to run. Don't run, just keep walking. But my legs had other ideas. Before I could stop myself, I broke into a sprint, my breath coming in sharp bursts of cold air. The sound of his footsteps quickened behind me. I ran harder, my shoes slipping on the damp gravel. The edges of the train yard blurred as I focused on the lights of the street just ahead. A few more yards, and I'd be out in the open where anyone, might see me. But the footsteps didn't slow. He was closing the distance, his pace steady, tireless. I reached the edge of the yard and stumbled onto the sidewalk, heart pounding in my chest. I turned, hoping, praying that he would still be far behind. But he was already at the edge of the tracks, stepping into the streetlight's dim glow. For the first time, I saw his face, pale, expressionless, with eyes that didn't belong to someone just out for a walk. He didn't say a word, just stood there, his gaze never leaving mine. I took a step back, then another, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. And then, without warning, he smiled, a small, knowing smile that made my skin crawl. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they know something you don't. I turned and ran without looking back, my legs burning with every step. I didn't stop until I was inside my apartment, every lock secured behind me. Even then, the chill from his gaze stayed with me. For days, I avoided the train yard. I told myself it was just a strange encounter, nothing more. But late one night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, the faint crunch of gravel, somewhere out on the street. I never looked out the window, and I haven't walked by the track since. I planned a weekend alone in the woods, just me, the fire, and the quiet. The idea was to get away from everything for a bit, to reset. But sometimes, the things you escape to are worse than what you leave behind. The first day passed peacefully. I pitched my tent in a small clearing far from the main trail and started a fire as the sun dipped behind the trees. The woods were calm, just the rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. It was perfect, or so I thought. As night fell, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. No wind, no insects, just a thick silence that pressed down on me. I told myself it was nothing and added more wood to the fire, trying to shake the creeping unease. That's when I heard it, a faint crunch of footsteps at the edge of the clearing. My chest tightened. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees, but all I saw were branches shifting in the dark. No one called out. No animal darted away. Just silence. "Hello," I called, hoping it was another camper or a lost hiker. No response. Only the windless hush of the woods. I sat back down, forcing myself to relax. It was just my mind playing tricks, I thought, but the knot in my stomach stayed. Something felt wrong. A few minutes later, I heard it again, soft, deliberate footsteps closer this time. They stopped just before the tree line, as if whoever or whatever was watching me, deciding what to do next. My hands trembled around the flashlight. I knew I should get inside the tent, but the thought of turning my back on the darkness made my skin crawl. I stirred the fire, trying to convince myself that the flames would keep anything dangerous at bay. For a while, nothing happened. The fire crackled, and the woods seemed to settle into their normal rhythm. I almost believed that whatever I'd heard was gone. But then, Just as I began to relax, the footsteps returned, directly behind my tent. I shot to my feet, heart pounding in my chest. The steps were slow, deliberate, like someone was circling the campsite, just out of sight. I shined the flashlight wildly, but the beam only revealed shadows shifting between the trees. I forced myself into the tent, zipping it up behind me as quickly and quietly as I could. The thin walls of nylon were no protection, but at least I was hidden barely. I sat there, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, struggling to steady my breathing. And then I heard it, breathing. It wasn't an animal's shallow panting. It was slow, deliberate, and deep, like a person standing just outside the tent. Each breath felt calculated, purposeful, as if whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. My entire body locked up, every instinct screaming at me to stay silent. I sat frozen, listening to that slow, deliberate breathing just inches away from me. I gripped the knife so tightly my hand ached. If the zipper moved, if the tent shifted even slightly, I'd fight or run. I didn't know which. The breathing continued, steady and calm. Whoever was out there had all the time in the world. They weren't trying to get inside. They were waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I sat there, heart hammering, straining to hear anything, a footstep or rustle, the sound of someone leaving. But there was only silence. Minutes stretched into hours as I waited for the intruder to return. But the woods remained still, as if nothing had happened at all. At first light, I unzipped the tent cautiously, my hands trembling. The clearing was empty. No footprints, no broken branches. Just the lingering sense that someone had been there, watching me all night. I didn't waste time packing. I stuffed everything into my backpack and hiked out as fast as my legs would carry me. Every step felt heavy, my heart pounding with the fear that whoever had been outside my tent was still nearby, following at a distance. When I reached my car, I threw my gear into the trunk and locked the doors behind me. Only then did I let myself breathe. I've told myself it was just my imagination, that there was no one in the woods that night. But deep down, I know the truth. Someone was there, and they let me leave. I haven't gone camping alone since. And every time I think about that night, I still hear the sound of slow, deliberate breathing just outside the walls of my tent. Don't forget to subscribe and watch more of my videos. Thank you.